Hi everybody, this is Jamie with C4 Depot, and I'd like to go over two products, Nebulator and Plasmafier, that we've created. Now, Nebulator is a rig that allows you to make these kind of cool little gaseous nebula-like eye candy things. And I think that they're pretty cool abstracts, and maybe some of the cooler things that you can coax out of Cinema 4D without a plugin. And then Plasmafier is a little tool that allows you to animate these plasma things, and they're eye-catching, I think. So the first thing you want to do is open up Nebulator and then get this interface broken off into its own little window so that you can use the object manager and the interface at the same time. But essentially, it consists of these various gases. Like you've got three fire procedural noises and a FMB fractal noise, a gaseous noise, and an electric noise. And these are all associated with pyrocluster and these particular shaders down here, which have the same names. And how it works is that it uses thinking particles to populate matrices along various objects like splines or platonic or whatever you want. I think it's actually easier to just start with something simple. That's why the default is to use a spline. But it'll populate clusters along these points, and then you can layer them and build out your nebula using a variety of different noises. So that's how it works basically. Now, to actually do this, you don't really need to use all of these noises. I mean, the more that you use, the longer it's going to take to render, so keep that in mind. But if you're going to try to make a space nebula using this rig, I would start with like one of these background noises, which would be the FMB fractal, the gaseous, or the electric cluster, and just pick one and try to get a background image that you think looks pretty good. Now, the caveat about this is that the preview renderer doesn't really work with thinking particles for some reason. I don't know why. You have to use the actual real renderer to figure out what this thing's really going to look like. Otherwise, you're going to be spending all this time looking at the preview render, and then you render it out. It's not going to match. So the way to get around that, to get it to go pretty quickly, is to use the world step size in the interface. And the default value is like 100. But when you're using something really big like an electric cluster, you might want to pop that thing up to like maybe 2000. So make sure all of these other clusters are turned off and just turn on one noise at a time. So we're going to enable the electric cluster, and we're going to figure out what shape is being used for the electric cluster. Let's open up the object manager, and this happens to be this thing called n-sided electric. So in this one, you can kind of add more points to it if you want to make it a bigger, different kind of a point, line or triangle. Right now it's just a triangle. Diamond might be okay. So let's just do that. And we've got the noise scale, which is, in this case, it's kind of tiny, interestingly enough. And the cluster radius is really pretty big. So let's just hit render and take a look and see what this thing produces. Okay, so we also have, by the way, I should mention this, we have a box of lights in here, and these lights are inside of a cloner. So these lights will actually affect the pyrocluster. So if you want to see what these things look like without any lights on, you just turn these lights off and you can re-render it. And it'll get rid of these hotspots. So I just wanted to let you know that the lights do affect pyrocluster, that pyrocluster illumination has been turned on, but it produces sort of this kind of star effect, like there are these little clusters of energy that are producing light. So if you're trying to go for something that looks like space, that might be a little bit more realistic, but it does affect the way that these things render. And I don't want to bore you with another render, but just keep that in mind. So if you like this, you can keep this and you can keep layering different noises onto it. If you think it's too dense, you can reduce the density by changing this to a lower number, and it'll become more transparent, and so on and so forth. Let's just turn this one off for a second though, and then let's go back to one of these other fire clusters and see what's going on here. So this one, open up the nebulator again. This one is using this thing called n-side fire 2. which is this spline. And if you want to identify that, oh, we got to turn this on. There it is. And it's a triangle now, but you can turn it into like a different kind of shape. You can make it just a line if you wanted to. And let's just do a render on this just to see what the default one is. And by the way, while it's rendering, oh, it's this little tiny thing there, but it's got like cool detail in it, you know. So another thing that you can do is you can use this preview checkbox to see how big the cluster roughly will render, you know, when you're playing with these sliders called noise scale and cluster radius. So by the way, if you make any changes to these settings, you want to rewind your timeline, and then that allows the program to kind of reset itself and recalculate everything according to the new settings. So with this new cluster radius, let's just see what it produces. Now that's getting bigger. I think I like that pretty much. And you want to probably make the detailed areas maybe a little smaller than the background noise. But the other thing too is that this is kind of a low resolution because I think we still have a large world step size of 2000. So let's just bring this thing down to like 100 and see what kind of a different result we get. And it will take longer to render because you're asking for more resolution. See, now we're getting something that looks a little bit more diaphanous, sort of like it's got some substance to it. Yeah, it's kind of looking kind of neat. So you can actually change the colors by just changing these knots in the gradient. And if, let's just, for kicks and giggles, I guess, let's just make this like really small. It's like 50% noise scale. And we may not have to rewind, but let's just do that anyway. And let's hit render and see what happens. Okay, now we're losing tons of detail because the noise scale is, oh wait a minute, I'm sorry. Noise scale is really, we're adding detail because the noise scale is really, so it's actually too small to even see anything. Let's go the opposite direction. Let's make this 1500. And that should give us something that looks a lot more like a, almost like a piece of fabric or something that's like billowing in space. Yep, there you go. So it's creating these clusters on these points because I only had 2 points. So let's just, you know, add a couple more points and for demonstration purposes, and then rewind this timeline and render that out again. And you should be getting a much more complex looking object in here. It's going to have more clusters in it, but since the noise scale is really large, it's just going to have its own kind of unique effect rather than something that's like really dense and has a, you know, a lot of detail that's almost more cloud-like. So let's go now. Let's just say that we like this, or we'll say we want maybe like another cluster. We'll add you know, another one of those. Rewind this thing, and let's turn on the gaseous or the electric cluster, and let's just render this out and see what happens. Okay, so our render is finished, and actually I gotta tell you the truth, I didn't like the render because I couldn't really see the inner cluster that much. So what I did is I made the electric cluster bigger to pull the clusters apart and create a little bit of a donut hole in the middle, and I reduced its density and increased its noise size. So that's the kind of trial and error, you know, you're going to probably have to go through to try to get the kind of look you're shooting for. But at any rate, this is basically it. You know, you got this background noise and it's kind of big and not a lot of detail. And then you got the smaller thing in the middle that's got more detail. And you can actually keep refining that or adding more noises to it as your fancy dictates. And you can make some pretty interesting looking things going on. So one thing that I need to let you know about is this is all Espresso driven, and a lot of these things are hooked up to Espresso. For example, if you see something in here that says object inside fire 2, which would be this thing, that is hooked up to Espresso. And I would not delete something like this. It'll probably just break the rig and then nothing will work. So if you like this shape, but you're saying, well, I just don't like having these things all on one plane, what you want to do is you want to copy this and then you can make that editable, and you probably want to just turn that off so you just don't see it anymore. And then what you can do is you can start taking these points and like messing with them. And this is not really hooked up to Espresso at all. I mean, you'll have to drag this thing into the little box. And now this new shape will be the one that populates the clusters. Or let's just say that, you don't want to do that, but you want to use a platonic or some sort of 3D shape. You can just put something in there and then drag this thing into here, and then you will have a shape that's like a 3D shape. So whatever you want to use is fine. And I would like to go into one little advanced thing that you can do. Let's just say that you're using a 3D shape and you don't really want things populated on the matrices, or let's just say you're using a spline and you want more than one cluster going in a straight line. You can open up this matrix object and it specifies distribution. Let's see, look at that polygon center. Or you can do vertex, or you can do count, or you can do volume. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. You can actually change the distribution if you go into the matrix object itself. And I think that's pretty much it for the Nebulator. It's a lot of poking around, but it's a lot of fun. So let's move right along to Plasmafier. Okay, so this is Plasmafier, and Plasmafier creates these kind of plasma balls that are animated, and it's a pretty simple program to use, or a little rig. Just open the Plasmafier interface, and this is all there is. Espresso is hooked up to every single one of these noises, so you can basically just pick a noise by clicking on it. This would be, fire cluster 1, and if you want to do a fire cluster 1, or maybe say like a fire cluster 2 looks colorful, let's do that. Just fire cluster 2, put that on the particle geometry, and then go into your interface, and you can basically control the world step size, which is your resolution. For this one, let's just pop this thing up to 100. And your animation speed could go really fast, kind of energetically, or it can go very slowly. You've got your density, cluster radius, and let's make that just a little bit higher for this, and your noise scale. So all of these products have kind of gone through the rigor of finding the sweet spot for the noise when you're trying to find the balance between the bias and the peak blends and all these things. So that's kind of really what the value is, and it took me like longer than I care to admit to like find those sweet spots in some of these noises, because a lot of the times you just get like this ugly looking ball and yuck. So I'm going to do the cardinal sin and just use a preview render, which really I told you before, don't use this, but this is sort of just make sure that at least it's producing something. So if you want to actually create something, I think this actually may be the same noise that I'm using here in this particular one, but let's check our render settings. Now in this case I have an output for a number of frames like 0 to 90, but if you want to just do like the current frame, let's just do that and just see what we get, and hit the render button, and we don't want to override anything. And if you want to get a faster render, as I said earlier, just increase this step size to something bigger. Let's just do that now. It's because I'm so impatient I can't stand looking at this thing. But I'm just going to try a different noise here and rewind the timeline. And by the way, in the Plasmafier you can slide various objects into here if you want to try a different spline. You can pop a different spline in here. These are not hooked up to Espresso unless you put them into the field value here. So, you can stick the platonic in here if you want to use that, or any of these other splines. You just swap them out as you choose. So let's just try a quick render here. See what happens. Okay, so this is a different type of noise. This is the gaseous noise, and kind of interesting. You'll get a totally different effect if you open up the noise itself and you move these knots around. So just for the fun of it, let's just see what happens if we say like move this gradient into a different spot. Yep, totally different look, and not much detail. It's kind of boring. But at any rate, so you can experiment with this and try different things out, and you will get completely different looks based on how you configure the gradient. That's kind of a little bit more interesting, I guess. And for this one, out of curiosity, let's just take a look at the noise size. So now the noise scales, it's not too big, but let's make it like a little bit smaller. And by the way, once you change the noise scale in here, it actually changes the noise scale for all of the procedurals, all the pyrocluster noises. So you're not going to save anything if you swap out your noise, just to let you know. And so I don't think you're going to need to do this on just changing the pyrocluster values, but I'd always just like to rewind it just to make sure. Okay, so it's getting a little bit more detail. Smaller noise size is a little bit interesting, and then you'll also get different effects based again on how you apply the slider. So that's pretty much it for Plasmafier, and this is a pretty cool program for just doing little background effects or abstracts for things that have nothing to do with outer space. But I hope you like it, and we'll see you at the depot. Thanks a lot. Bye bye now.